Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, the book I'm covering doesn't have a cover anymore because it almost doesn't even have a back cover. I've read Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien dozens of times, and the cover on the book shows it. I'll show you what the front cover looks like. I'm covering back in the day I wrote my name. I'm not showing you my name, but this is what the front cover looks like. There is no front cover, that has long since worn off. This is what the side of the binding looks like. You can see the Return of the King right here. And this is what the back cover looks like. Again, it's falling apart if you open this up. Ooh, yeah, it's barely holding on. I am gonna put this back down. A lot has been said of the Return of the King, and there's not much I can add except to say it, like I said, I've read this dozens of times. I first read it on my dad's copy, which was nowhere near as beat up as this one. And then I ended up buying my own copy, used from a used bookstore, I think in Maryland, Southern Maryland, where I used to live. And, you know, I don't think that bookstore exists anymore, but let me double check. So, yeah, that bookstore no longer exists, but back in the day, I picked up Return of the King. I'll put the cover art, if I can find a copy online, a copy of that image, I'll put it up. But there's not much to say about Return of the King that hasn't been said already by people more eloquent and more educated than myself. But it being my birthday this month, this is actually probably going to be posted on my actual birthday. I'd like to talk about one of my favorite books because I've been rereading it lately, and not this copy, a copy much better condition than this. And I want to talk about two aspects of it that are so impactful to me in my own reading of it. And partly I do have to get into the Two Towers for this. Okay, so I can't find my copy of the Two Towers. I think I already packed it. For context, I am going to be moving, which is why 3 videos this week show me wearing the same Wildermyth shirt. Wildermyth is my favorite video game, and Return of the King isn't my favorite book, but it is one of mine. So it's a combination near and dear to my heart for my birthday. So The Return of the King is noteworthy partially because J.R.R. Tolkien was very particular about the words he used and what definitions he was using when he referred to them. And what do I mean by that? This word is used to describe 5 different men, all of them lords or prominent members of their culture of men. One of them is in the Two Towers, and that is the first example of this word. And I'm going to read out to you the passage in which it is. But nothing of this evil which they had stirred up against them did poor Sam know, except that a fear was growing on him, a menace which he could not see, and such a weight did it become that it was a burden to him to run, and his feet seemed leaden. Dread was around him, and enemies before him in the pass, and his master was in a fey mood, running heedlessly to meet them. That word, fey, is only used to describe 5 different men. And again, back in Concerning Hobbits, it is described that hobbits are a race of man, that they are one of the second children of Ilúvatar, that it's a bit of a stretch. You don't think of them as men because they are so small and different in size compared to the rest of the men presented in Middle Earth, but Frodo is described as fey. And as the Oxford English Dictionary describes it, well, I can't actually read that. Fey is a word that means to give off an air of otherworldliness, perhaps even of a supernatural nature. And that is probably the older definition that Tolkien was using in his works. There are a couple other examples of the use of the word fey, and they are all used to refer to The four lords of men presented, the ones that fight or are involved with the siege of Minas Tirith. The first instance in Return of the King that uses this word is in the muster of Rohan. Merry asked the question that was tormenting him. Twice now, Lord, I have heard of the paths of the dead, he said. What are they, and where has Strider, I mean, the Lord Aragorn, where has he gone? So it's the discussion of the paths of the dead. Then why has Aragorn gone that way? Asked Merry. Don't you know of anything that would explain it? Unless he has spoken words to you as his friend that we have not heard, said Eomer. None now in the land of the living can tell his purpose. Greatly changed he seemed to me since I saw him first in the king's house, said Eowyn. Grimmer, older, fey, I thought him, and like one whom the dead call. Maybe he was called, said Theoden, and my heart tells me that I shall not see him again. Yet he is a kingly man of high destiny, and take comfort in this, daughter, since comfort you seem to need in your grief for this guest. It is said that when the Eorlingas came out of the north and passed at length up the Snowbourns, seeking strong places of refuge in time of need, Brago and his son Baldur climbed the stair of the hold and so came before the door. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years, tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. And then a voice came out of him, as it were out of the ground, and to their amaze it spoke in the western tongue, the way is shut. So this is a region of death, of otherworldliness. In Lord of the Rings, the dead, especially dead men, are different. And in this case, it's not certain whether or not the men that called the region that became known as the Paths of the Dead, whether they swore on Iluvatar or not, but what is known is that their souls were not at rest. They were able to linger until the heir of Isildur, Aragorn, called upon them. The second instance of the word Fey being used in The Return of the King, the first time it was spoken by Eowyn, and the second time it is used, it is in the chapter The Ride of the Rohirrim. At the tail end of this chapter, and this is, by the way, a section that you can find. J.R.R. Tolkien read a recording of this passage, and I think it was one of his favorite passages. In the movies, and this is one of the things I lament, in the movies, this was modified, this speech that Theoden gives, and the part of this that Eomer says becomes molded with Theoden's. At that sound the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect. Tall and proud he seemed again, and rising in his stirrups he cried in a loud voice, more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before, Arise, arise, riders of Theoden, fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter, spears shall be shaken, shield be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises, ride now, ride now, ride to Gondor. With that he seized a great horn from Guthlaf his banner-bearer, and he blew such a blast upon it that it burst asunder. And straightway all the horns in the host were lifted up in music, and the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like a storm upon the plain and a thunder in the mountains. Ride now, ride to Gondor. Suddenly the king cried to Snowmane, and the horse sprang away. Behind him his banner blew in the wind, white horse upon a field of green, but he outpaced it. After him thundered the knights of his house, but he was ever before them. Eomer rode there, the white horsetail on his helm floating in his speed, and the front of the first Eored roared like a breaker foaming to the shore, but Theoden could not be overtaken. Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. In that case, when they are referring to, Fey, that otherworldliness, it calls it out explicitly that he is like one of the Valar, the creating spirits of the world, riding out to do battle against Morgoth in the first age of the world, that in that moment he felt almost divine. And in the story, his horse is of an ancient and holy lineage as well, that they are descended from the Meras, which are descended from Orome's horse, that his steed is their lineage. And so he blasts out, and this is an aside to the whole thing, but in Return of the King, when Theoden is referred to, almost alluding to him seeming like Orome the Great, he is one of two people in the Legendarium that I know of that are compared to Orome, or to, I think, even mortals, one of the children of Iluvatar, to a Valar. And the other one is Fingolfin when he charges out to face Morgoth, and I'll read that passage. It's, again, a big aside. Now news came to Hithlum that Dorthonion was lost and the sons of Finarfin overthrown, and that the sons of Fëanor were driven from their lands. Then Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses, and filled with wrath and despair he mounted upon Rocalor his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dor Nufaglith like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Orome himself was come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. So, again, Theoden is being described as Fey and like Orome in an honor given otherwhere in the Legendarium only to Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor, in his fury and anger and his lone ride out to challenge Melkor, Morgoth. And Morgoth came. And so Theoden, in that moment, is as otherworldly as any other man has ever been in the entire series. But that is not the last time Fae is used, not least of which of the House of Yorl, the folk of Yorl, but also Theoden is described as Fae, and shortly thereafter, Éomer is described as Fae. To set the scene, this is when, after Éowyn has slain the Witch King, and Merry fallen, stabbing the back of the Witch King's leg, which allows Éowyn to then deliver that final blow after Theoden has said his final words to Meriadoc, to Merry. The Eored of Éomer shows up, and they see King Theoden on the ground. Slowly Theoden opened his eyes. Seeing the banner, he made a sign that it should be given to Éomer. Hail, King of the Mark! Ride now to victory. Bid Éowyn farewell. And so he died, and knew not that Éowyn lay near him. And those who stood by wept, crying, Theoden King, Theoden King. But Éomer said to them, Mourn not overmuch, mighty was the fallen, meet was his ending. When his mound is raised, women then shall weep. War now calls us. Yet he himself wept as he spoke. Let his knights remain here, he said, and bear his body in honor from the field, lest the battle ride over it. Yea, and all these other of the king's men that lie here. And he looked at the slain, recalling their names. Then suddenly he beheld his sister Éowyn as she lay, and he knew her. He stood a moment as a man who is pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart. And then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him, so that all speech failed him for a while. A fey mood took him. Éowyn, Éowyn, he cried at last. Éowyn, how come you here? What madness or devilry is this? Death, 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 death take us all. Then, without taking counsel or waiting for the approach of the men of the city, he spurred headlong back to the front of the great host, and blew a horn and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice, calling, Death, ride to ruin and the world's ending. And with that, the host began to move, but the Rohirrim sang no more. Death, they cried, with one voice loud and terrible, and gathering speed like a great tide, their battle swept about their fallen king and passed, roaring away southwards. It's hard to read that without tearing up a little, and I kind of am, because of just the tragedy of him finding his daughter he believes dead on the battlefield. In the movies, that death, ride to ruin and the world's ending is uttered by Theoden. And I think Eomer's part was cut because it would have extended the length of the film. But even in the extended edition, they didn't edit it so Theoden gets his part and Eomer gets his. So it is one of the things I'm not as happy with the film about, because this is an important part for not just Eomer, but the characterization of the men on the battlefield, of men in their struggles against Sauron. In overall, this moment is impactful. It is the emotional core of this battle that Theoden has charged. He dies in battle. Eowyn, his niece, then seemingly dies, killing the Witch King, thus fulfilling a prophecy that no man can slay the Witch King. And Merry himself aids in that part. He doesn't himself slay the Witch King, but creates an opportunity for Eowyn to do so. Then Eomer comes upon the battlefield, sees his family, the only family he has left, seemingly dead on the battlefield, and he is driven into a rage of madness and despair. This is the end of the world. The Rohirrim are going to die here, but they are going to die as gloriously as possible. I spoke out of order. So the instance of Aragorn being described as Fey is first. The chapter next, The Siege of Gondor, has the second description of a Lord of Men being described as Fey. The Lord's errands are urgent and should not be hindered by me, said Baragond, but tell me quickly, if you may, what goes forward? Whither has my lord gone now? I have just come on duty, but I heard that he passed towards the closed door, and men were bearing Faramir before him. Yes, said Pippin, to the silent street. Baragond bowed his head to hide his tears. They said that he was dying, he sighed, and now he is dead. No, said Pippin, not yet, and even now his death might be prevented, I think, but the lord of the city, Baragond, has fallen before his city is taken. He is fey and dangerous. Quickly he told of Denethor's strange words and deeds. I must find Gandalf at once. Then you must go down to the battle. I know. The Lord has given me leave, but Baragond, if you can, do something to stop any dreadful thing happening. The Lord does not permit those who wear the black and silver to leave their post for any cause, save at his own command. Well, you must choose between orders and the life of Faramir, said Pippin, and as for others, I think you have a madman to deal with, not a lord. I must run, I will return if I can. So Denethor is the second description of being fey, and then following that, again we see Theoden, third, being called fey, and this is glorious, and instead of deathly and otherworldly in a somber sense of the grave, Theoden and Eomer, fourth, get described as fey. They know they're going to die, but they're going to go out as gloriously as possible. They are otherworldly in that moment, and that is one of the magical moments of the Lord of the Rings, and specifically the Return of the King. But on top of that, there's one more moment that really sticks with me in the Return of the King, and I think it's kind of funny because there's a woman in The Return of the King who is only introduced after the battle on the fields of the Pelennor. The lady's name is Yoreth. And in the Houses of Healing, all might have gone for ill had she not opened her mouth. Gandalf is in the Houses of Healing, going about getting giving as much attention as he can to the people that are there sick. He only knows of Eowyn and Faramir. Merry shows up a bit later, dazed on his feet. Pippin then sends a man to get Gandalf. Gandalf comes back, brings Merry there, and Yoreth says something that, this is her line. Then an old wife, Yoreth, the eldest of the women who served in that house, looking on the fair face of Faramir, wept, for all the people loved him. And she said, Alas, if he should die, would that there were kings in Gondor as there were once upon a time, they say. For it is said in old lore, the hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so the rightful king could ever be known. And Gandalf, who stood by, said, Men may long remember your words, Yoreth, for there is hope in them. Maybe a king has indeed returned to Gondor, or have you not heard the strange tidings that have come to the city? I have been too busy with this and that to heed all the crying and shouting. All I hope is that those murdering devils do not come to this house and trouble the sick. Then Gandalf went out in haste, and already the fire in the sky was burning out, and the smoldering hills were fading, while ash-gray evening crept over the fields. Yoreth gets other speaking lines in that chapter, but Gandalf was too busy to think of one of his greatest resources, which then goes on to shape the Houses of Healing, that chapter. Yoreth says the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. That's the old lore. And Gandalf remembers Aragorn is not just a kingly man, a leader of men. He is also a ranger and knowledgeable of the ways of healing. And later, the master of the Houses of Healing quotes Yoreth and the other women. He says, Unless, of course, you give heed to rhymes of old days, which women such as our good Yoreth still repeat without understanding, when the black breath blows and the death's shadow grows, and all lights pass, Camathelas, life to the dying in the king's hand lying. He's saying that he doesn't really know the purpose of Athelas, but that the old women speak such lines. It is but a doggerel, I fear, garbled in the memory of old wives. Its meaning I leave to your judgment, if indeed it has any, but old folk still use an infusion of the herb for headaches. Then in the name of the king, go and find some old man of less lore and more wisdom who keeps some in his house, cried Gandalf. After they fetch the Athelas, king's foil, as it is otherwise known, Aragorn uses it, and it has a wholesome scent, one that is used to, I think earlier in the books, in the Fellowship, it was used to help Frodo. In this hour, it is used to help Faramir. And it says, Suddenly Faramir stirred, and he opened his eyes, and he looked on Aragorn who bent over him, and a light of knowledge and love was kindled in his eyes, and he spoke softly. My lord, you called me. I come. What does the king command? Walk no more in the shadows, but awake, said Aragorn. You are weary. Rest a while, and take food, and be ready when I return. I will, lord, said Faramir, for who would lie idle when the king has returned? Farewell then for a while, said Aragorn. I must go to others who need me. And he left the chamber with Gandalf and Imrahil, but Beregond and his son remained behind, unable to contain their joy. As he followed Gandalf and shut the door, Pippin heard Yoreth exclaim, King, do you hear that? What did I say? The hands of a healer, I said. And soon the word had gone out from the house that the king was indeed come among them, and after war he brought healing, and the news ran through the city. And she gets other words. The Houses of Healing is honestly one of the most impactful and serious and also comedic chapters. Oftentimes when the Fellowship is regathered, there are some humorous moments. In Flotsam and Jetsam, when Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli are reunited with Merry and Pippin, there's a bit of humor there. And again, with Merry and Pippin and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli in the Houses of Healing, Merry says something along the lines of not wanting, he would like his pipe and his pipe weed, but then he considers, maybe I will never pick up the pipe again because I never got to share some pipe weed with Theoden. And Aragorn says, all the better to smoke in his memory. And Merry says, I think I left my backpack, which had the pipe and all my other belongings, on the battlefield, if someone could get it. And, that's a paraphrase. And Aragorn then goes, he has been going for like a week straight with maybe 12 hours of sleep during that entire time. He hasn't eaten in 3 days, and he just exasperatedly goes on this rant about, if you think I crossed the entirety of Gondor and Rohan through the paths of the dead to summon the spirits of mortal men who claimed, fealty to my ancestor, and then crossed and defeated the Corsairs, and in the nick of time brought my banner and my reinforcements to the fields to save the the city Minas Tirith, just to find you, your pipe and pipeweed. In this moment, you are crazy, and now I need sleep. And then after Aragorn leaves, Pippin says, your backpack's at the foot end of the bed. Like, he must have seen that the whole time. You silly fool. Like, this is where it is this whole time. So Aragorn knows that, but he chooses to be sassy in that moment. Like, it's a very comedic moment. And then Yoreth is turned a bit more into a comedic character as well, because during the crowning of Aragorn after the Battle of Minas Tirith, he refused to enter the city as Lord. Instead, he enters it as Strider, the captain of the Dunedain, the captain of the Rangers of the North. And when he returns, Faramir, now recovered as steward, attempts to relinquish his title, and Aragorn says, no, I'm going to need you more. The king still needs his steward. And Yoreth is there with her kinswoman and kind of doing some like play-by-play kind of excited discussion. And she says, oh, that would be Aragorn the Tall. Like I said, the hands of the healer. She's narrating her knowledge of this moment to her kinswoman. And then there's a second moment later on where Faramir asks, as part of this duty, as part of this crowning of Aragorn, he lists off Aragorn's accomplishments and achievements and titles and says, do the people of Gondor accept him as their king? Everyone's shouting, and Yoreth is now commenting to her kinswoman again, and they're cut off, and then the crowning happens. And that scene is done really well, though, because they cut Yoreth from the movies. There's also, that instance of her is cut in the movies as well, that she's kind of giving that play-by-play. It's a strange bit of humor by J.R.R. Tolkien that I think is just really important to the story. And like I said, in other times throughout the story, prophecy and omens are given a lot of weight. No man can slay me. I am no man, by Eowyn. And when she stabs the Witch King, when Aragorn passes through the paths of the dead, and by the way, he then ends up meeting, in the movies it's not a thing, but in the books, as he encounters a battle between the Corsairs and the men of Gondor, everyone flees except for this one lord. I want to say Baldur is his name. Angbor, the lord of Lamadon, had the heart to abide us, and Aragorn bade him gather his folk and come behind, if they dared, when the grey host had passed. At Pelargir, the heir of Isildur will have need of you. And later, after Aragorn has arrived to Pelargir and defeated the Corsairs, Angbor shows up with his men, and he is later referred to in the last debate, and all mentions of this lord are during this one chapter, the last debate, but he is mentioned by Legolas first, and then he shows up again in the narration by Legolas, and then following that, there is a moment where he is mentioned by Aragorn as Angbor the Fearless, that this man stood in courage even with the ghosts of the dead all around him, and he did as the heir of Isildur asked. He doesn't say all this, but like, this is the context, is that the heir of Isildur has need of you at Pelargir, and this man shows up with his men in tow, as many knights as he could muster, and Angbor the Fearless is going to be one of the anchors of Minas Tirith. They're going to take as many men as they can spare to the Black Gate, but Angbor with his men coming up the roads are going to reinforce Minas Tirith so they do not leave it completely defenseless. So it's a really cool moment. This guy, a single man, is so fearless that he stands among all of this, um, these spirits, and and acknowledges his soon-to-be lord. It's one of those things where like these individuals that show up only for one or two chapters in Return of the King are so important to the narrative, and only in small ways, involving prophecy, involving, foresight, involving courage. It's one of those aspects of the Lord of the Rings that enchants me. This has been a long video, but those are a couple moments from Return of the King that I just really, really love. And this is part of why I read, is because of those moments where a single word describes a mood so well that the same word that can be used to lift the hearts of the reader can also be used to bring the reader to tears. This is why I love The Lord of the Rings, and Return of the King especially. And on a more macro level, reading in general. So, yeah. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.